the world's #1 podcasting platform for African stories.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining in. I'll just wait for Africa Podfest to join in the chat. Thank you guys. It's International Podcast Day, so happy International Podcast Day to everybody as we just wait for Africa Podfest. Hi, Mr.
Hi, Angela.
Hey, how are you doing?
Podcast Day.
Happy International Podcast Day. How are you doing this afternoon?
Very well, excited, and just happy about everything that's happening today. And thank you so much for inviting me, joining you in this chat.
Yeah, definitely. Africa Podfest is, integral in the podcasting industry, so we definitely have to do this. Yeah.
Awesome.
People are joining us, yeah. So today we'll be talking about the growth of podcasting in Africa, but from the data perspective. Yeah, so maybe we can just start with you, give us a short introduction about who you are and how Africa Podfest started.
Yes, so my name is Melissa Mbugua. I am co-founder and co-director at Africa Podfest. And what Africa Podfest is a platform to amplify and scale up the podcasting industry that's still young, but growing very fast in Africa. And our vision is that we build an audio industry in Africa that is inclusive, that centers the voices of marginalized communities, and that's sustainable. For us, the dream is to see an industry that's actually sustainable in the stories, in the audience, growth in the money,
Yeah. Okay. So we celebrated Africa Podcast Day in February, and now we are celebrating International Podcast Day, which is amazing. So thank you for being here. So Africa Podfest is instrumental in the industry because of the research you have done on podcasting. You released reports, Is This Mic On, in 2021 and the Discovery Tour in 2022. How would you describe the podcasting industry in Africa? Can you say it's grown? Is there any growth in the industry?
Definitely there's growth. When we started in 2019, Afripods was already there, had already been there for a while, for some years. And so that you could count literally like how many formal podcast players there were, who were thinking about it from an industry perspective. And of course, the number of independent podcasters had been growing gradually. So I would say industry-wise, it's grown a lot, especially in terms of the number of people who are individuals, but also who are in media and already in the content space, who are now thinking and investing actively in podcasts. That's definitely increased a lot. The conversation inside like brands, companies in the advertising space, in the media space, in the nonprofit space around podcasting is really growing. So in that way, yes, it's grown a lot. Also, just in terms of how podcasters themselves, even those of us who consider ourselves like independent podcasters, are gathering a lot more. There are a lot more initiatives, like we've seen, Africa, the recent amazing APV awards, and also the different communities in different parts of Africa, the work that you're doing around community as Afripods as well. So it's organized. The industry, the space is organizing itself. And we see it as Africa Podfest. The more people organize and come together, then that means that's the basic foundation for industry growth, because we start to make collective moves. We start to kind of act together towards creating like business models, towards pushing for policy change and everything that we need for the business side of things to start to grow. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely the collaboration is important. Like we can't act in silos. We all have to act together to grow the industry. So
Exactly.
I can say people tend to bundle all the countries in Africa as one. It's just a thing people do, right? But from your research, your 2022 research, the Discovery Tour, you looked at Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Would you say there were any major similarities or differences? Are we very different from each other, or are we similar? From the
Both.
findings that you
Yeah,
got.
from the findings, yes,
Yeah.
both. So we are different in terms of, especially from the audience side of things, the way audiences are engaging with podcasts, how they listen, the kind of podcast people are interested in is quite different in the different countries, which you expect because people are
Yeah.
very diverse and different, and our cultures and tastes and behavior is different. But
Mhm.
there's a lot of similarity in terms of what podcast creators, the challenges that podcast creators are facing. And that's
Mhm.
because I think contextually, a lot of the challenges or the environment, a lot of the factors in the environment are similar. For example, high cost of internet access that cuts across most African countries, or if not all, actually, African countries. So that's a barrier. Electricity supply, um, lack of awareness or availability of like podcast specific infrastructure, training, capacity that cuts across, and
Yes.
also from the industry side, like just the media, the advertising industry and investor side space just hasn't yet been cultivated and become aware of the potential of podcasting, and so
Yeah.
there's a challenge with accessing resources. So those kind of foundation or environmental factors are similar,
Yes.
but in terms of what audiences want, what the stories people are telling through podcasts, how the brands are growing, it's so different in each country, which is what makes podcasting in Africa so cool, because
Yes.
no place is the same as
Yeah.
yeah.
We're similar, but we're not the same at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've touched on challenges, and I mean, for me, working at Afripods and also having a podcast myself, I can confirm there are some barriers when it comes to podcasting, starting with the fact that there's a lot of information out there, but it's mainly from the West. So sometimes it's not relatable, And like you mentioned, infrastructure, let's say we're talking about electricity, internet, and also access to audio equipment. That can be a struggle for Africans or anyone in general. Like you've mentioned a few challenges from your research. How can we use data to resolve these issues?
Yeah, that's a really a good question. So the reason, maybe I can answer it also by kind of explaining how and why we started getting into research.
Yeah.
We all ask these questions, as people who are either podcasters or who want to get into the space as ecosystem or industry builders. We all have questions like, who are the audiences? What are the most successful podcasts? We just have
Yeah.
so many questions.
Yeah.
But then at least when we started, there weren't many places where we could get answers. So we figured, okay,
Yeah.
I guess we have to answer this ourselves. And so that's
Yeah.
why we started doing research. And what we found is that data, especially when the data is more, like multi-country, so that, like you said, Africa is not a country. So
Yeah.
for us, we didn't want to also kind of set up on this footing that continues with that narrative that Africa is a country. That's why we're very specific about gathering data from different countries to show that if you're interested in going in growing specifically in this country, this is what you need to think about. If you want to go Pan-African, this is what you need to think about in terms of how the region is generally. And so the data helps because it allows all of us collectively to start from a point of a base that's stronger in terms of collective knowledge, or at
Yes.
least collective assumptions,
Yeah.
So I think it helps all of us to, at least when we're coming to the table and want to collaborate, we have this baseline knowledge, which is credible, which which has been tested, which has people from the ground and and who are in these different countries can say, actually, yeah,
Yeah.
this information that's in the report, it's legit. Of course, it's
Yeah.
not. Research can never tell you every absolute piece of information, but the idea is that we start from a foundation that is, we're not at zero, we are starting at least from one.
Yeah.
In a collective sense, so that even when we are talking to, when you're making your pitch, your business pitch to a potential sponsor, you can produce this information and say, you know,
Yeah.
based off of this, and this is why I'm building my business case this way, because the
Yeah.
audience in Nigeria is like this. Based on this report, you can cite the report and say, data
Yeah.
has shown the audience is like this, therefore I want to grow my podcast in this way. So it's
Yeah.
more about knowledge is power, really.
It
Yeah, and like
Yeah.
you said, before when you Google about podcasting, there was really hardly any information about Africa.
Yeah.
So for us, it's about creating more content we create, including like even this IG live, you know, on all the lives we do, all the content we create and make available strengthens all of us who are in the space. That's my long-winded answer.
It's not long-winded, it's just perfect, because what you're saying, information is power. So without the information, people would feel like they don't even know where to start, you know. But if they're able to read on, you know, the stats and everything, at least they get a glimpse of what the industry is like, and they can feel like, okay, maybe I can try and do this. It's not too far-fetched. It's something like next to us. Yeah. So I've also done some research on radio and podcasting, and we know that radio it's still the largest medium in Kenya and in Africa. But I can say definitely podcasting is definitely picking up, because from the research I did, I found from the respondents that did the survey, I found that 56.4% listen to podcasts sometimes, meaning they know about podcasts and they actually listen. Therefore, we can see there's a change in listening behavior as we get more, you know, with the digital media, because technology is constantly changing. Because you work closely with the community, do you think people are more receptive to doing things differently and start listening to podcasts and even start podcasts themselves? Because there's the listening part of it, and they're the people who want to start podcasts. Are people getting more receptive to the idea?
Yes, I think they are. And the reason for that is we are, you know, as people, we are hungry for a different kind of story, or a story that really resonates with wherever we are in our life journey. And a lot of times, you don't hear those stories in the media. We're used to not hearing exactly that specific kind of story that works for me in general media. And that's what makes podcasting so cool, right? And so appealing, is that it's a format that allows for such diverse and deep and rich kinds of storytelling. So yes, I think what's driving the growth of podcast listenership is the depth and the difference, or the diversity in the way the stories are told, the freshness of it. Yes, the word I was looking for was freshness. The freshness in narrative, even the way we get to hear stories about ourselves. So, for example, there's this real, like, new rising hunger for understanding pre-colonial African history, and we really want to know, like, who are we? Because we didn't learn this in school. You don't see this generally. This information is not available. But there are a number of podcasts coming up that talk about that stuff. So it's like, oh, I think that's what's driving audiences to podcasts. It's not that they think, audiences, I don't think, care, you know, about podcasts themselves. They'll just go where the story is, where the story they want is. Yeah. And so far, podcasts are really offering that space for storytellers to be able to really just express themselves interestingly. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're chasing the stories. It's not necessary. And the stories, because they're so different, you won't find them on mainstream media. But with podcasting, people have free will to give the stories that people actually want.
Exactly. And that's one of the interesting points we found in our research as well, that people in the radio space are starting to realize this. Of course, there's always this sense of how can we stay, radio is also thinking, how can we stay ahead of the curve and not lose audience, because that also means we lose relevance and, you know, sustainability. And so there've been some examples of like partnerships and syndication with like podcasts that
Yes.
have worked for radio, and I think, to me, I feel like radio is not going anywhere, as you said. So
Yeah.
I think it is more about how do radio and podcasting find ways to work together in a way that makes sense for everyone, including, but most importantly for the audience, right?
For the audience, yes. Okay. I mean, we're speaking about podcasts, and Africa Podfest have a podcast called Semanasi.
Yes.
Please tell us about it and what inspired you to start Semanasi's podcast.
Yes, so Semanasi podcast is our podcast about African podcasting. It's the meta podcast hosted on Afripods and produced in partnership with Afripods. And what inspired us to start this podcast is that in our day-to-day work, we get to talk to a lot of really interesting people who are shaping the African podcast space, both on the continent and beyond. And we wanted to open up those conversations with the wider podcasting ecosystem, again in that spirit of creating that strong baseline of shared knowledge, so that we can break the silos and collaborate more. So we have episodes which feature interviews with really interesting people, and we go deep. So you do get to kind of meet the guests themselves, and to hear the work they're doing in African podcasting and their why, and you just get to really understand how the people who are in the African podcast space are thinking, moving, what their vision is, what their plans are. So yes, head on to Afripods and listen to Semanasi podcast.
Available on Afripods. And so what would your advice be to the African creator, like on taking space in the podcasting industry? Because a lot of people, I've come across a lot of people, they feel like they can do it, they have the ideas, but they're just scared.
Yeah.
What would your advice be?
Yeah. My advice would be connect with people. Now we have lots of community spaces in the podcast space, virtually, and in community hubs in different countries. So look for your podcast community. Follow them on social media, find out where they're hanging out, join them, and then also collaborate. Like just collaborate. Collaborate. That the mindset of collaboration just needs to be. It's the only way that anyone who's succeeding right now in the African podcast space, it's only collaboration. And then thirdly, move and do the most with what you have currently. Just do the most. Like test the limit of what you can do with the equipment you have now, with the storyline you have now, with the audience you have now. Just everything you have right now before you even think about what you need to acquire. Like just do the most with what you have now.
Yeah, that's true, because people tend to overthink it and think, oh, I want to be the best podcaster and have 1,000 listeners in a day. But you have to start somewhere. Start with the equipment that you have so that you can learn what you need to improve on. But you can't improve on something that you haven't started. So yeah, that's a really great point you've given there.
Yeah, and then something else, a lot of people, I think, might assume that the space, the space is maybe there's a formula, or you have to like unlock certain levels of like knowledge or whatever to but the truth is it's still early days, so you could literally just DM Afripods, email them, email Africa Podfest, and Angela herself will respond to you, and Melissa, myself will respond. Like the space is still so young that it's not actually difficult to connect with people and to collaborate. So and to ask for help, and to, for example, with the awards, the APVA awards, a lot of the people who won in the ceremony, I was watching the ceremony, and so many people were so surprised, the podcasters, and feeling so, there was this sense of like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for the recognition. I never expected this. So people are doing their work and focusing, but then because the space is so young, a lot of podcasters didn't even ever expect that they'd ever get an award,
True.
So So I think if you're gonna get in now, because things are growing fast, and right now it's a lot easier to get in with everyone, with who's who and what's what, and then grow together. Yeah, don't wait for things to
very
get bigger.
accessible at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so as we wrap up, maybe you can tell us what's next for Africa Podfest. Do you have any more research coming up, or what can people look forward to?
Yes, our next kind of big thing that we're really excited about and we're working on, we announced in August, at the end of August, is Africa Podcast Day 2023, which will be hybrid, in person and virtual. It'll be in Nairobi, 12th of February. So look out for that, for our announcement soon. When the tickets are opening soon, we're announcing the program. That's really exciting. And of course, 2023, further research, and more community, more research. But watch out for the festival. Save the date. And if you can get to Nairobi, make sure you come.
Yes. People have to be there. It's gonna be great. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Melissa, for joining me and having this important conversation about the growth of podcasting and telling us more about Africa Podfest, because what you're doing for the community is amazing and it's important, and we need people like you. So thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you also for the work you're doing. Thank you to everyone for joining us in this conversation. And happy International Podcast Day.
Happy International Podcast Day to everybody. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to listen to Semanasi on Afripods. And thank you, Kofisi, for inviting us to this beautiful studio to do our lives. And so we still have more events for International Podcast Day. We have one more Instagram live at 2 p.m. talking about the importance of community. So please tune in on Afripods, and also a Twitter space on Africa's podcasting growth at 3 p.m. and the business behind podcasting at 7 p.m. Our Twitter handle is at Afripods, and you can also reach out to Africa Podfest on what are your handles?
Africa Podfest on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And on our profile here on Instagram, you can get links to all our other spaces online.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Melissa. Have a good day.
You too. Bye. Bye.